joined from Rugby in the United Kingdom by Tim Wilson, who's political analyst. Professor Wilson, thank you so much for joining us again here today on Anews. Today is, whichever way you look at it, a new day in the history of Afghanistan. The US troops, the final foreign forces, were withdrawn about almost 24 hours ago now. So the future of Afghanistan is now an unwritten book. What is your reaction to this step in history?
Well, I think there's two issues. The first, I'm sure the newspapers will be filled with pictures of Major General Chris Donahue being the last soldier to leave tomorrow. And now we have to look forward. And so on the one hand, we have to think of the huge number of deaths which have been generated by this conflict. And it's not a conflict simply over 20 years. We keep saying this is a 20-year war. That's the American involvement.
Absolutely.
For the Afghans, it's a 40-year war. And certainly in this recent episode, 240,000 Afghans have died, 2,500 US soldiers, 457 UK soldiers. There were 15 Turkish soldiers, I think, who died. And then there was a Spanish crash with 62 Spanish soldiers dying in Turkey. I mean, wherever you look, this has been a conflict with a very, very high death toll, greater than the Falklands, greater than Iraq, really. And it's been catastrophic. And the West is leaving in defeat. There is no question about it. Now, we've got that on the one hand. On the other hand, we've got the efforts by the new regime in Kabul to set up a government. I hear the name of Hekmatyar being mentioned, which is very interesting. That tells me that the Taliban is reaching out beyond its immediate group, is reaching out to people who were part of the original Mujahideen in the early 1990s and before. I think this possibly is good, but we don't know. And on the other hand, you've got the extraordinary sight of various politicians in America and in Britain doing whatever they can to divert blame from themselves. I mean, Mr. Raab has never worked so hard as he's been working in the last day or two to confirm that, he's not to blame for anything. I think there's 3 or 4 issues. He just keeps coming out with denials. The latest one, if we ignore the fact that when he was in Parliament discussing the Afghan crisis the other day, he was seen giggling with Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, behind Boris Johnson. This is outrageous. This was supposed to be a serious debate on the 18th. And then we now learn that not only did he not call his Afghan counterpart while he was on the beach sunning himself in Crete, but for 6 months he's not called either the Afghan counterpart or the Pakistani counterpart. He says that this isn't credible, this isn't a credible story, but it's again another denial. And it seems to me this isn't. This is a foreign secretary who is dilatory to the point of indolence. This isn't about hindsight or even enjoying the beach in Crete. It's about a dereliction of duty and a mockery of his office. If we think back to the Falklands, Lord Carrington resigned the moment the Falklands was taken, and that is a spirit of honour that Raab should have followed. He should have offered his resignation 2 weeks ago, but maybe he's not a man of honour, and just go on and on and on. We now hear that the US are claiming that the British wanted to keep the Abbey Gate open, and that led to the suicide attack. So it's the British fault, and the death of the 13 US soldiers and the multitude of Afghans who died. And Raab says it's not the case. Another denial by Raab. And today, I don't know whether you covered this, but we've learned that a journalist was being taken around by Taliban patrol, and he came across documents giving the names of Afghan soldiers and interpreters who'd been helping the British. The failure just gets bigger and bigger.
In fact, yes, lots of digital information out there giving very frightening insights into people who might be tracked by different groups. This is, of course, very worrying. But of course, as you point out, the denial game, the lack of responsibility is appearing in many places, not least in the UK and especially in the United States. No doubt, in the same way that previous incidents have spurred years of investigations and inquiries, they'll make a great meal of maybe dragging it out even longer than the 20 years of their involvement, the US involvement in Afghanistan. What I was going to ask you, it's not just the last person in post that is shrugging off responsibility. It's the culpability of the last. We can talk particularly about the last 20 years because the 20 before that was the Soviet Union's involvement. But throughout this long history, there's been people trying to do something in Afghanistan, but not perhaps really clear what it is that they are trying to do.
Well, you know, this is the graveyard of empires, and that expression could go all the way back to Alexander the Great, who's the only leader who actually managed to conquer Afghanistan, and then he died. So I don't think there's a very good track record of people moving into Afghanistan. But you know, the finger of blame will point not only at Biden but also at Trump. Trump is the one who let the Taliban out of the prisons, and it's those prisoners who formed the leaders who charged up to Kabul. So that would not have happened without Trump. So you could say, if you were being extremely naughty, that Mr. Trump is taken up, but not completely, because I'm afraid the finger of blame will point to Mr. Trump too. And if we are playing the blame game in the West, what worries me is that a similar sort of game is going to be played in Afghanistan as well, and this is where people are going to get caught, in the crosshairs, and this is why the leaving of information about who was involved in helping the West will be so fatal and so damaging.
Because it can be used in nefarious ways, indeed. What is it that, as well as somehow getting, we hope to have news in the coming days of what the plans the Taliban have towards creating what they've described as a potential unity government. We were speaking earlier with Anews coordinator, who's Orhan Salih, who's actually in Kabul at the moment, giving very positive feedback from what he's been hearing from the Taliban, that they have changed. It's not the same Taliban as 2001. What is it that the Afghanis need now?
Well, they need a government of unity. They haven't had a government of unity in years. Even if you go back to the days of the king, this wasn't quite a government of unity. And it was one faction holding sway over many little groups. And so if the Taliban can set up a government of unity, and I think by contacting Hekmatyar that they're showing some signs, and I saw some of the report by your reporter Orhan this morning, with him walking across the airfield. And then talking to the Taliban spokesperson, and this seemed to me to be very positive. It's positive in the one sense that it looks as if the Taliban are taking the idea of government seriously. On the other hand, you know, what is the future of people who have committed themselves to Western ideals, the women who have got careers and who are fully expecting those to be squandered, gay people, the Christian minority in Afghanistan. These are all groups that I worry about, no matter how committed the Taliban are to a government of national unity. And of course, one's also thinking about those people who are left behind by the British and the American chaos. Yes, on the one hand, this was an amazing feat of amazing exit in a space of time, but it could have been significantly faster if we hadn't been so caught up in a mess of red tape. So when James Cleverly, who's one of the Foreign Office ministers, was talking the other day, he was in fact throwing blame on a fellow called Penn Farthing, who's got an organisation which has moved a lot of animals out of Kabul, and great, because the Taliban have made it very clear in their last administration that they don't welcome pets at home. So these animals have very little future. However, Penn Farthing was trying to get his own staff of 70 Afghans back to the UK as well, many of them trained as vets and veterinary nurses, and that didn't happen. And James Cleverly was basically should be in his direction and in the direction of the senior politicians in Britain onto Penn Farthing, and was saying that Penn Farthing had wasted a lot of time, I don't think it's true that because of Penn Farthing people were prioritising a dog over a child. It seemed to me that James Cleverly put his finger on it by saying there were two systems. There was a system that would have meant Penn Farthing could have got out of Afghanistan, and there was a system that would have dealt with his workers, the Afghans. Now, in my mind, there should have been two systems. One system to get people out of the country, and another system, perhaps controlled in a third country, to process people into the UK. That wasn't done. All the processing was done in Kabul, and Rod today was talking about how difficult it was dealing with people who were largely undocumented. That should have been a conversation that was happening later on, and instead we wasted a lot of time. There were aircraft leaving Kabul that were empty. It's a national and international disgrace in every possible way, and it sets out a standard of behaviour that is despicable. And I cannot see how the Taliban could trust the West in the future. They may be rubbing their hands with glee and thinking they can take advantage of the West at the moment. Mm-hmm. But really, we need to be cementing trust. And at the same time, we see around Afghanistan, the Russians and the Chinese are conducting maneuvers and war games, saber rattling. This is, again, very worrying. But we need in the West to be talking to the embassies which are functioning in Afghanistan. That is the Turkish embassy, the Russian embassy, the Chinese embassy, particularly the Turkish embassy, because now the Taliban, I understand, have asked Turkey not only for help running the airport, but also for help with education, which is astonishingly positive. Indeed. And for some sort of financial help as well. Maybe Turkey is the conduit down which we in the West can move, because Turkey is, after all, a member of NATO.
And Turkey is also a country with long historical ties to Afghanistan and some cultural overlap. They can understand each other. The two countries can understand each other much better. And this may be one of the interesting comments from the Chinese Foreign Ministry was that the US policy of imposing its values and social systems on other countries is bound to be unworkable and will only end in failure. And this seems to be, you mentioned trust. We talk about the United States and other countries saying, can we trust the Taliban? Interesting, you remind us that trust is a two-way street. Can the Taliban trust the other countries? But this idea of imposing our will on countries just doesn't work anymore. Well, it never has worked, but it clearly doesn't work.
if you're going to impose your will on the country, you have to stay. You have to commit to stay. I always go back to the example of the end of the Second World War. The British and the Americans were in Germany until the end of the 20th century. And in fact, the Americans still are in Germany. Mm-hmm. This is a long-term investment. You don't simply change a country overnight, and a 20-year war is actually a short campaign. America has not thought this through. I think America didn't think this through at the point when it invaded Afghanistan, and it certainly didn't think it through in the last 20 years. It's astonishing how little thought has been given to this. And there are plenty of people who have thought, and there are some very large books, but generally talking about the collapse of the British Army, for example, and the destruction of our ideals. And yes, do we want the world to embrace an American paradigm? I don't think we do necessarily. I think there are. I think we want people in their own countries to be independent and to embrace independence and to do so with confidence. I'm very positive about anything that encouraged an independent and confident Afghanistan, but I'm afraid the problem is that independence and confidence
I've got to interrupt you.
Comes with anxiety about terrorism.
I've got to interrupt you. Joe Biden is now speaking in Washington. Thank you so much for joining us today on Anews. I look forward to speaking with you again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
So we'll now go over to Washington to hear what Joe Biden has to say.